All right, guys. So jumping into this will be kind of unique for our class. On Moodle right now, there is a review, and it's not a review for a test or anything. It's more or less just a review of things that we've gone over so far. If you fill out that and show it to me on Wednesday, then you actually will get points for that. So, have any of you seen that already and know what I'm talking about?
I think I looked at it, but I'm not sure. I'd have to look again.
Okay.
Yeah,
So
I saw it, but I didn't know what it was for. So
okay, perfect. So I will go in there and throw a description on there or something. But if you can fill that out online, great. There's a place to submit it. If there's not, I think there is. If there's not, I'll go in there and add one. But really, all I want to see is that you did it. You can use your notes. You can use whatever. In class, usually we'd go through and try to do as much as possible without notes first, and then finish out whatever with your notes. So preferably try to fill it out with what you already know, and then the parts that are iffy you can go back and try to find those in your notes. So think about that as being something that's for your benefit, but you will get notes for completing it. So you can fill it out online, you can print a copy, whichever you want to do. It will be filled out for a grade, but at the end of the day it's just for you. So not too difficult there, but that will be the assignment before Wednesday. And if you guys can remember, we talked about paper color and paper grain last week. So had quite a bit of fun there. And in my opinion, those are uh, two of the my favorite lessons to teach anyways. And now we're getting started on paper finishes. So paper finishes are kind of fun because we're adding on to the foundation of what you already know basically about paper. We talked about paper, how it's made, talked about paper grade, paper weight. Once you know those, then you can specify that in paper, but now you'll be able to specify the actual finishes of paper and the different qualities that go into that. So after grain, after color, next step is the paper finishes. So that's what we'll be looking at here today. All right. So a finish, the definition of that is the characteristics of a paper's surface. And if you guys haven't already grabbed your notes, I see Gracie, you got yours going, so that's good. You can go ahead and grab your notes to fill out a few things from this PowerPoint. So the characteristics of a paper's surface, how does it feel? How does it react with printing? And how does it work for the end uses of the job? So the first things we're going to look at is the physical properties that are affected by the finish of paper. So the first is ink holdout. That is the ability to keep ink on top of the surface rather than absorb into the sheet. So you kind of see in this picture here, what we would assume is when something spills on top of a paper, it's going to soak into the sheet of paper. Well, ink is kind of the same way because usually ink is going to be more of a liquidy consistency. Now, digital printing is a little bit different, but still has kind of that same concept. So ink holdout is that sheet taking on the ink, but not allowing that ink to soak in. If the ink soaks in and bleeds through the back of the sheet, you're going to have trouble seeing what's supposed to be on the other side because the front has bled through to the back. So you don't want that to happen. And actually, if it has good ink holdout, you might even have to use less ink to get your job done. So there's a couple of different benefits to having good ink holdout, but depending on the kind of job you're doing or the kind of ink you're using, it does need to have some sort of ink um, absorption. So it has to be able to take on the ink without the ink just scraping off, but you also don't want it to soak into the ink too much or into the paper. Sorry. That happens when I'm not talking to a group of people. And maybe it happens when I'm talking to you guys in person too, but I always notice it when I'm not talking to you in person. Next one is brightness, and that's the measurement of light reflectiveness on a sheet of paper, and it affects the contrast and halftone reproduction. So we talked about this a little bit with color, and the paper finish can actually really affect the paper's color as well. Although brightness has more to do with reflectance, whereas color has to do with a shade or hue of the paper. So they kind of go hand in hand, but they are different. And the reflectiveness of the paper, think about the difference of a coated sheet of paper. And I guess if we haven't looked at that yet, we'll have some examples in class later. But maybe think about a sheet out of a magazine. Those are usually really slick, and those are going to have a higher level of brightness than, say, a chapter book or something that you would typically open. The multiple page booklets that are more that thicker, coarser kind of paper that are more of a dull color. The color is different, but also that reflectance is going to be a lot different because they're not a coated sheet. I don't know if you guys can picture that. I'm trying to think of an example that's probably pretty close to home, but that brightness makes a really big difference on the printing quality of just on that sheet and how that reflects, especially if you're talking about a 4-color process image, or if you're printing pictures of people, because those kind of things are really easy to sense a difference in. Even on screen, you're going to see tonalities and faces totally change because you've lost some of that depth, and brightness, reflectance makes a big difference in that with printing. Then we have opacity, which is a pretty easy one to think of. It's the ability to limit show through of printing on its other side or from sheet to sheet. So anytime you're printing double-sided, you need a sheet that has really high opacity. And that means that when you flip the sheet over and look at the other side, you shouldn't be able to read what's on the front of the sheet. And we've all read stuff that it's hard to read the back because you see the other letters kind of filtering through, and that's a sheet with fairly low opacity. So depending on the quality of your piece, the higher the quality of the piece, the higher the opacity is going to be, so that when you look at page 1, all you see is content on page 1. When you look at the back of it, all you see is the contents of that back of the sheet. So you shouldn't have so much of a bleed through of each. Thickness and weight of a paper makes a big difference in that, but your coating will too, or your finish, because depending on how it's finished, it's going to change, possibly change the thickness of the sheet, but add an additional layer in there that prevents us from seeing through. So that can be really helpful. And smoothness is the flatness of the sheet. So if you picture a piece of construction paper versus a piece of photo paper, a photo paper sheet is going to be really smooth. Construction paper is going to be really rough, and the finish of the paper is going to be part of what determines whether it's really chunky or really smooth. And for the record, smoothness is really easy to differentiate of saying how smooth a paper is. But if you're talking about the roughness of a sheet, usually you would describe that as a paper's tooth. If a paper is really chunky like construction paper, you call it toothy paper. It doesn't mean it's lost a tooth. It just has, I don't know who came up with that terminology, but it just means you have a really rough surface of your sheet. So that's an extra one. All right, so those are the 4 different characteristics that are affected by the paper's finish. Now we're going to look at the 2 different kinds of finished paper. You're always going to have either coated or uncoated sheets. And when we talk about a paper's finish, we're talking about both coated and uncoated. And a lot of times I think people get this wrong because they will think that only coated sheets have a finish, but uncoated sheets have a finish as well. It's just not necessarily, it's not so much an additional coating put onto the paper in production as much as it is the texture of the sheet or things that are done to the sheet to either smooth it out or give it a specific texture. So both uncoated and coated sheets have a specific finish attributed to them. So the definition here, I know you guys probably already read it off, but paper with no additional coating added to the sheet is uncoated paper. The surface tends to be rough and porous, but as we'll find out here in a second, there's some other caveats to that. Before moving on from this slide, real quick, if you look at this picture, I don't know how hard it is to see on your screen. You might not see as much difference as I do, but it shows more reflectance on the coated sheet than the uncoated sheet. And that is pretty typical. Whether it's lightly coated or heavily coated, your coated sheets are always going to have higher reflectance. And just to throw that in here while we have this picture, I don't think I have this picture in here again. So here's some finishes for uncoated paper. Vellum is one. Its slight roughness to the touch is something that characterizes this. And I just mentioned construction paper, but vellum is about as close as you're going to get to that kind of construction paper feel, where it is pretty rough, very toothy. So that's how you can tell that one apart. And these are all finishes, just to go back a second. When we're talking about uncoated papers, these are finishes that apply to a bunch of different grades with a bunch of different weights, and different ones can have the same finish. The same ones can have different finishes. So that's kind of how you can apply it to what we've already talked about in this unit. Smooth paper is paper that has been slightly calendared. And we talked about this briefly in class, but if paper has gone through the paper making production process, once it comes out of that, they can either leave the paper as is, and it's going to be a really rough, toothy paper, or they can run it through another process called calendaring. And they can also go through another process called super calendaring. So there's 2 additional steps that can lead to smoother paper and then really smooth paper. But that's just to put sheets through really heavily weighted rollers that have steam and other processes in there. If you think about when you iron your shirt, that's in essence kind of what's happening to this paper. It's being pressed and compressed together so that it's got the same amount of fibers. No additional coating is going onto it. It's just getting pressed so tightly together that it smooths and evens out any of those inconsistencies. And the super calendaring just takes it the next step further and compresses it even more. So when we talked about the weight of paper, and we talked about bulk, and the one is escaping me now. I'll remember it as soon as I move on from this subject. But in that same, where we're talking about the thicknesses of a sheet of paper, that's going to bother me until I can think of it. But when we're talking about those thicknesses of the sheet of paper, the calendaring plays a big part in it. Even if the fibers are the same, the weight of the paper is the same, the thickness or the distance that that sheet takes up can change based on calendaring. And now we're getting to some fun ones. A laid finish is paper with a wavy pattern across the grain. It has kind of a chain mark look into it. Those chain marks are watermarked into the paper, and we've talked about a watermark, but whenever you talk about a watermark, that's something that takes place while the paper is being produced and while it's still pretty waterlogged. So as the paper is losing its water content, as the heat is compressing that out of it, the let's see, pulp. All my words are leaving me. The pulp is compressed onto some sort of a form. In this case, kind of chain marks. And that form is across the entire width of the conveyor belt. So when that paper dries, the surface has that same look to it. And once we're back in class, hopefully on Wednesday, we can take a look at some examples of what this looks like. To print on this can be a little bit of a challenge, because if you're using just typical digital printing, and usually that'll be a laser process, and with the laser printing process, it just lays toner down on top of the sheet of paper. Well, with how many grooves this has, it really makes for an uneven, kind of gross looking print on digital printing. Offset tends to do a lot better just because it's more liquidy, so it'll soak into the grooves a little bit more. But laid is one you have to be kind of careful of and use for just specific purposes. And you definitely have to know what kind of a look you're after and know what you're going to get when you try to print with this kind of paper. Linen is a little more forgiving. I actually printed all of my wedding invitations with linen paper. It resembles fine cloth, even rows of lines or dots in a crossing pattern. Kind of has that crosshatch effect. This one tends to be a little bit more smooth with just those grooves running through it. And they actually create linen paper specifically for digital printing, which makes it work a lot better to get that even consistency with toner. It still kind of works better with offset printing though. Offset just has a level of quality that digital, I don't know if digital will ever catch up to it. Then we have parchment, where the color varies through the sheet with light and dark areas. So you see that splotchy kind of look. You guys probably at some point in your childhood received some sort of a certificate or paper printed that looked a little bit like this. We cook on parchment paper, but it's a little bit different. This is specifically designed for printing, and it's definitely got a paper feel to it. Just having to do with the way it was printed. A parchment it's considered a finish, but it happens during that paper production process. And then we have felt. So felt is a really heavy duty sheet usually because those fibers are so loosely compressed, and it's a very, very rough surface. It on the slide, it says it resembles a piece of felt. If you felt one of these sheets of paper, it literally feels like a paper version of a sheet of felt. It's very thick, very rough, really nice for different tags. Usually felt is only going to come in cover grade, at least from my experience. And I think I can dig some out to show you guys what that feels like. It's a really nice feeling paper, but it can be really hard to print on. It's great if you're trying to print really high quality tags for retail or those types of deals. But a lot of times you want to be really considerate of how you're going to go about printing that. The old letterpress printing works really well for stiff paper like this. So then those are all the uncoated paper finishes. Here are the coated paper finishes. If it feels like I'm going kind of fast, I do only have 40 minutes on here due to not having an actual Zoom license, but I don't think we'll have any trouble wrapping up a little quicker. Not being able to see you guys keeps me from getting on quite as many rabbit trails, which is not as fun, but it still works. So coated paper. It's paper with a coating applied to the surface to achieve higher opacity, brightness, and other special properties for printing. Just in general, coated sheets tend to hold up better over time. If you're thinking about something that's going to see the light of day at all, it's good to have a coated sheet because it keeps the sun from deteriorating the printing quite as much. Let's see. It also just kind of has a protective layer so it doesn't get broken down by handprints or smudges, any of those kind of things. It gives you a tougher sheet. There's a lot that kind of goes into play of why you would want a coated sheet. Appearance is a big part of it because a coated sheet is going to handle high quality printing a lot better. Anytime you're printing photorealistic prints, you usually will want to use some sort of a coated paper. If you're printing with inkjet, it's really finicky if you don't use coated paper. Whatever variety of coated paper doesn't really matter, but if you have uncoated paper, the paper dust that tends to form will actually clog up your print heads and make printing really hard. So by having that coated sheet, it eliminates a lot of those potential problems with your print heads and printing. All right, so yeah, just kind of what I was just mentioning, some of the attributes of printed paper: paper gloss, surface reflectance, which we talked about there before, ink holdout. If it's a coated sheet, the ability of that ink to sit on the surface rather than soak in is going to be a lot higher. The surface texture is going to be really smooth. Opacity is going to be higher, so you're going to have less see-through sheets with that extra coating on there. The ink gloss, so that ink is just going to stand up off the sheet and have really good quality, really bright colors. It makes a big difference if you're doing promotional posters or something that you are really wanting to be eye-catching. That coated sheet really makes the colors pop. and your bulk. So that overall bulk is going to be more because of the coatings on both sides of the sheet. And on that, you can have, and I guess I have that one listed on here, but it doesn't have to be coated on both sides. It can be coated on one side and uncoated on another side. And then you can use those attributes as you would need. So for instance, on this one, a postcard is a situation where you would only want it to be coated on one side because you do want it to hold up in the sun. It's going to be handled a lot. It's really going to go through the fire as far as paper handling goes. But you also need to be able to write on the other side without your ink smearing because it's coated. So that's a really good example of why you would need to have both. So here's a few different kinds. It's a little more straightforward with coated sheets. We have matte coated paper, which is lightly coated and lightly calendared. And it's what's funny to me is that usually if somebody says, I want this printed on a matte sheet, they mean uncoated. Usually that's what people think of because matte is so much less glossy and reflective than gloss, which we're getting to here in a second. So if somebody comes to you that isn't well informed, we could say, about paper, they're going to ask for a matte sheet and they mean something that is uncoated. So just so you know, you can kind of, if somebody asks you for a matte piece of paper, you can kind of filter that and say, so are you talking a coated sheet or an uncoated sheet? What are we trying to get to here? But matte does tend to be somewhat rough and it has less ink holdout, but it still has a little bit of reflectance. I'll have to show you guys again on Wednesday. That makes a huge difference to see the samples of these different sheets. But I really like printing with matte because the print quality is really high. The appearance of the ink is really good. The toughness of that sheet is really good, but it doesn't have the super glossiness that'll just kind of kill your eyes when you look at it for 2 seconds. So it's a really, really good sheet if you're looking for high quality, but not that super glossy 90s look.
We
Then we
use the matte coating for our Christmas cards, if you'll remember that. I'm pretty sure.
Right. Okay. That is actually a good thing to bring up. So you're talking about the UV coater.
Okay.
And that's actually something that happens after printing. And you are correct in that it is a coating and it is that what we used at Christmas was matte.
Okay.
But that is in addition to what happened at the paper making process. Like way back when this paper is being formed, it was created to be either coated or uncoated. And then we can take, let's say, a matte printed sheet. We can print those invitations on it, but then we can go back and put it through our coater and put a coating on top of that sheet. And
Okay.
if we're doing cards or envelopes or cards or postcards, anything like that, that extra layer of coating is going to protect it from the sun and give it that glossy appearance even more.
So you can do it both before and after.
You got it.
Okay. That makes
I
more
agree.
sense.
That gets a little confusing, but yes.
And it doesn't necessarily have to be matte paper that you use before to do it afterwards. You can use a different paper before and then coat it with matte afterwards.
Exactly. In
Okay.
fact, I think if I remember, and I guess we did do coated one side for the cards that we made, and they would have been glossy printed or glossy coating on the front. And that's what we coated with matte coating. So by putting that matte coating on there, it actually kind of toned down the gloss coating that would have been on the one side of that sheet, if that makes any sense. So you can put gloss paper through a UV coater and put matte coating on top of it, and it'll give you a really good effect. You can really kind of play with those to get a different effect on your final piece.
Is that how they do it for like pictures? If you order like a matte picture, do they send it through a UV coater or how do they do that?
That one is the paper. That would just be the paper that they use. So it'd be a matte type photo paper, which I think is actually to blame for why people will ask for matte paper when they mean paper that's uncoated, because they think about the difference where a matte sheet is not super glossy and in your face, whereas the gloss is more reflective. So it's interesting to think about how those things work together in different areas, because photo paper that's matte is going to look much different than a cover sheet that I'm using for industrial printing that is matte coated. And it is really interesting how those all work together. And if you want to really carry through consistently, you'd want to print whatever you're printing on a matte sheet, coat it with matte coating, and then you'd get that complete picture at the end. Same thing, print on gloss, coat with gloss coating. That would probably give you the best result. But at the end of the day, you can kind of change those up. And regardless of which kind of coated paper you use, you can use different UV coatings. Now, UV coating can only happen on a coated sheet. You can't actually coat an uncoated sheet. And I think we might have looked at some examples of that when we did it in the lab, but I can't remember. If you try to coat an uncoated printed sheet with UV coating, then I just got my 10-minute warning. I was going to say, then it really will fill in those gaps and not look very professional. So yeah, that's kind of where that goes. All right, better get back on this. Looks like we only have 10 minutes. And if we do have to finish out, if we have to lose the connection, we can probably hop back in with that same link and wrap up. So if I don't get a chance to wrap up and it closes down, hop back on, and I think we'll be able to use that same link to come back together and finish this out real quick. All right, so dull, and that was a really good question, by the way, Eric. Glad you brought that up so I could clarify that. It's really interesting to see how those two work together. So dull paper is coated and calendared, meaning it's going to be a smoother sheet and it's got that coating on it. Dull coated paper is another really nice one that's not super reflective, but it has a really good printing quality. The surface is smooth and level, but does not have a high gloss value. And honestly, high gloss these days is kind of something that's looked down upon a little bit. Anytime I bring up gloss to our designers, they're like, "Ugh, gloss, just don't use gloss." And I don't know fully why, except that it just kind of gives it more of an industrial feel. And it was way overused in the last 10 or 15 years to where that was all you would see. And it started to become a very commonplace thing. So as people were trying to stand apart from their competitors, they actually started going back to the less glossy, more natural, just kind of, it makes you think of more of a friendly conversation kind of a piece rather than an industrial advertisement is kind of the best way I can think to describe it. I'm sure there's other reasons for using one or the other, but usually the designers will come to me and go, "Do you have do you have dull or matte rather than gloss?" Yes. And then we have the obvious one, which is gloss. Highly coated, highly calendared. The surface is very smooth with high gloss and high ink holdout. Some gloss or dull sheets also come with an embossed finish. So really high ink holdout is a big one here. If you really want a piece that's going to grab people's attention, having a high gloss piece is really a good choice. It is very reflective. You're going to get really good halftone reproduction on this, very good 4-color process images. Anytime you need really bright, vivid colors, gloss is a good way to go. But really any of the coated sheets are going to be better on that score than the uncoated sheets. So it really just depends on what kind of a message you're really trying to get across. Another reason why as a designer, it's helpful to know what paper your design is going on, because then you kind of know how to adapt to meet those needs. If you're printing on uncoated sheets, you might want to stay away from the vivid, bright colors because they're going to kind of look washed out and not look exactly like they look on your screen. If you're designing for coated sheets, you might not want to go for as much of a natural look because that gloss is really going to take away from anything that's trying to look natural or earthy or approachable. The embossed finish is just something, some sort of a design that could be inlaid into that paper. Then we have cast coated, known as CC1S. And these sheets are specially coated on one side, which gives the surface a mirror-like finish. So we're talking extreme gloss, very, very reflective. So reflective that it almost looks like a mirror. And cast coated, the CC1S means it's cast coated on one side, and the other side is probably going to be coated as well in this case. But usually what I would purchase is C1S, which is simply coated on one side rather than the cast coated on one side. Because anytime you see cast coating, think super high reflectance. So yes, coated one side. C1S is a sheet that is only coated on the one side, used when only one surface of the sheets needs to exhibit the qualities of a coated paper. Just like postcards or greeting cards that we talked about earlier. Sometimes we've printed rat cards like that at the college because our representatives for the college want to be able to write on the back when they go out to different fairs and things. So that's a good one to choose. So just some additional notes on all that. Not all grades will have finishes. Bond, writing, offset, text, and index are generally going to be uncoated only. And actually, text should not be in there because text does come in. I'm not actually sure why I have that on my slide. I need to edit that. Text comes in a lot of varieties of coatings. Book is always coated, and cover is definitely going to be the most variety. Cover can be coated or uncoated and has a lot of different coating varieties. But I would say cover and text are typically the most common, where you'll see a lot of different variety there. The ones up here on the top are going to have a bunch of different uncoated finishes. So kind of interesting to think about. You'll definitely find a lot of these in smooth, super smooth, those kind of things will be apparent as finishes. So if somebody asks you for a matte finish, you might want to grab one of these and say, do you mean this? Or do you mean this nicely matte coated cover sheet over here? Because there's a difference. Usually they're like, oh, the first one that you should, yep, the one that's not matte coated, for the record. All right, so that is all I have there. I think we're shutting down shop here, looks like, in about 3 minutes. So just to wrap up, the plan is to come back in person on Wednesday. Looks like we have a chance for snow and bad weather then too. So stay tuned. Hopefully we can go back in person, and I'll probably be pushing more for an in-person class on Wednesday than I was for today, just because feeling those samples is really important, I think, to get this total idea across. So try to be in class on Wednesday. If it's really bad though, we'll push it back. I think the college will close if it's that bad, but I will plan on seeing you guys then. Any questions from today's class before we get kicked out of here?